Good morning and welcome to NCASA's Spring and Summer Webinar Series, where today we're going to be focusing on which legislation made the crossover deadline in our General Assembly and remains eligible for action to possibly become law this year. I'm Katherine Joyce, Executive Director of the North Carolina Association of School Administrators, and I am pleased that you are with us today, where I'm going to be joined by the other half of our NCASA advocacy team, Elizabeth Yelverton, our Legal Affairs and Policy Manager, to bring you this update this morning. Our session is co-sponsored by two of our great partners, Pierce Group Benefits, which is a President Circle partner, and Admentum, which is a Leadership Alliance partner. And you'll be hearing briefly from those great partners in just a bit as we move into today's session. So if we can take a look at what we have on tap for you today, our agenda for today's segment. So we're going to be focusing on the crossover bills, as I mentioned, and we'll explain a little bit about what crossover means. And we're going to go through the bills by topics of interest. So personnel benefits, testing accountability, curriculum instruction, virtual learning, financial operations, school choice, school calendar, athletics and events, and last but not least, safe schools and healthy students. We're going to work in the words from our two sponsors throughout the session today. And then at the very end, we'll touch briefly on which education bills already have been signed into law this session and which are on the way, already on the governor's desk, and then trying to answer any questions that you might have for us on any of the topics that we cover throughout the webinar. So we want you to be sure and put your questions in the Q&A box, which makes it easier for us to see those and make sure that one of our team can help answer them. You also are free to put comments to each other and to our team in the chat box. But for questions you want answered, please use the Q&A. So without further ado, let's get rolling this morning. And it is my pleasure at this time to welcome our President Circle partner, and they are our longest standing President Circle partner since 2011, the Pierce Group Benefits Group. And representing them today is our good friend, Gray Spivey. So Gray, welcome, and we're happy to have you with us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a great weekend. I know mine was crazy. I went from a baseball game to a soccer game to a ballet recital, then to a birthday party for my great aunt. So when I tell you that I'm excited to be back in the office this morning for this webinar, it's because I'm really just ready for a break. I'm excited to be able to just sit and learn, with you guys of what's coming out. And, like Katherine said, my name is Gray Spivey. I work at Pierce Group Benefits. And I just want to thank you for allowing us to be a part of this. We love our partnership with you guys and really see the value in these webinars and conferences. So again, thank you. At Pierce Group, we do partner with 87 of the 115 school systems in North Carolina. And guys, thank you for that. We know that you put your trust in us to take care of your employees. And so we do not take that lightly. Thank you so much. And for those that we do partner with you, thank you for allowing us to serve you. And for those that we don't partner with yet, we are looking forward to the opportunity to do so in the future. Now, really, I could ramble on and on all day, but honestly, I'm excited to hear about these webinars and updates and everything. So I'm going to jump off and turn it back over to you. Guys, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Gray. We appreciate that and for all the support to this organization and our school districts. So at this time, I wanted to give you just a little bit of information about crossover and our session by the numbers so far this year. And so you've heard us mention crossover. To explain what that is, it is a self-imposed deadline that the General Assembly establishes in each year that they operate. And that is a deadline by which policy bills have to move from one chamber to the other to remain eligible for consideration. And that crossover deadline is limited to policy bills. So bills that affect appropriation, taxes, things like pension and retirement, constitutional amendments, referendums. For instance, if we have a school bond referendum, those would be exempt from that self-imposed crossover deadline and could still be taken up this session. But if they are strictly policy related, they must pass by the deadline, which this year was May 13th. So it was last Thursday. There are some workarounds, of course. Never say never in the General Assembly, because even if a bill doesn't make the crossover deadline, it can still be revived. And there are many ways to do that. A couple that we've seen utilized in the past would be taking the content of a bill that's failed to cross over, adding it to another measure that has crossed over later in the session. So even if we have beaten a bill that you don't like, we have to stay vigilant to make sure it doesn't reemerge. And then also, sometimes just adding a small fee or appropriations to a bill makes it an appropriations or tax bill, and thereby can keep it alive that way. So lots of ways that lawmakers can utilize their process and keep things moving. But we're going to focus today mainly on the bills that have crossed over, that are policy bills, and I'll just give you a sense of what's in them and what you might see ahead for the remainder of this session. There are a lot of bills out there. You can see that more than actually 1,690 bills have been filed between the House and Senate this session. NCASA and our team, we are tracking almost a third of those, just over 500 bills that we are monitoring because they have some kind of impact for K-12 education. Last week, as the crossover deadline approached, there were 77 bills that we saw moving from one committee to another or one chamber to another. So a very busy week for our team, trying to stay on top of what was going to make the cut and which ones did not. And ultimately, as we hit that crossover deadline, that left us with 147 policy bills that made the deadline and are still active. And a lot of others are remaining active as well because they are appropriations measures that we might see in the state budget process is still yet to come. So with that brief introduction, we're going to move now into our first topic of bills we wanted to cover for you today. And those are bills dealing with personnel issues and personnel benefits for our school employees. And I am pleased at this time to introduce Elizabeth Yelverton, our Legal Affairs and Policy Manager, who's going to walk you through those topics. So Elizabeth, welcome and take it away.
Thanks, Katherine. As Katherine noted, I'm Elizabeth Yelverton. I'm the Legal Affairs and Policy Manager for the School Administrators Association. People at the General Assembly know me a little bit better as Katherine's minion or sidekick. We are the Advocacy Team. We're small but mighty, and we do definitely work hand in hand every week to keep track of all of these bills and really make an effort to let you guys know when something is really good or really bad, and we might ask for your help on a few bills. But to get us started this morning, I'm going to be talking about our personnel benefits bills and issues and things like retirement and state health plan. So let's get right started with that. Okay, so to start off with, I just wanted to mention House Bill 46, which would create stronger whistleblower protections for state employees. So this would actually require state employees to report violations of state or federal law, fraud, misappropriation. I'm not going to read all of this, but obviously something that would be of interest to the state and its management and its financial management. Basically, it would provide an incentive for employees to blow the whistle on these sorts of misappropriations or actions by providing immunity from civil liability for anyone who reports in good faith, but also, well, actually, sorry, it looks like it was amended, but the employee identity also remains confidential and is not a public record until the matter is resolved. So it actually gives that incentive by remaining confidential and really incentivizing our state employees to blow the whistle on these types of actions. Another bill would be House Bill 362, which would revise personal leave costs for teachers. We saw this gain traction during Teacher Appreciation Week, which was great. It would eliminate the requirement for teachers to pay $50 for a substitute if a reason for leave is provided. So right now, we all know our teachers have to go through a lot, and they have a harder time taking time off if they're sick, or if they just need the day off, because they do have to pay for a substitute. So this was actually introduced by Representative Elmore, who is a teacher himself. So that was pretty interesting, and we're glad that this one made crossover. Moving on to Senate Bill 473. This is another one of these enhanced local government transparency bills. So we're always a little skeptical of transparency, because what transparency means to one person doesn't always translate to another person, especially when our school employees and administrators are the ones that are effectively having to deal with the practical implications of these different bills. So 473 would require local finance officer to garnish a board or council member's compensation in order to collect for unpaid county and city services. It would create a new felony offense for public officers and employees who personally benefit from their position. And it would also just define a public officer or employee that is also a director of a nonprofit organization. So this is, sorry, let me continue that. It would say that they would be deriving a benefit from a public agency contract if that is awarded to the nonprofit. So a lot of us, especially our school administrators who are on boards of nonprofits, definitely make sure that you pay attention to this bill and make sure that you are meeting all these requirements, especially if this does end up becoming law. And I should point out right now that unless Katherine and I otherwise point out, all of these bills that we're mentioning did cross over. So they are eligible for consideration for the rest of the session, unless we noted otherwise, like with Senate Bill 355, the Government Transparency Act of 2021. You can see that this actually failed to cross over. It actually made its way successfully through multiple committees, even though NCASA and other groups voiced some opposition to the bill, but it was actually scheduled to be voted on, and they pulled it off of the Senate floor and actually referred it back to committee, which you hardly ever see. So there was definitely a lot of issues with this bill, and honestly, we're glad that it didn't cross over. But as Katherine mentioned, legislators do have other ways of kind of revitalizing a lot of these a lot of this proposed legislation. So make sure you keep an eye on bills like this. So moving on to teacher and administrative licensure issues. House Bill 159. So this is kind of an omnibus bill, and just, anytime you see something that says education law changes and you're saying, I wonder what this is about, it's usually because it's kind of a smorgasbord of different issues that kind of relate to each other that they all kind of put in one bill. So this bill is actually a helpful bill. It would expand the lifetime teaching license to include administrators and instructional support personnel with 30 or more years of service. A similar bill, House Bill 428, this is actually a bill that Katherine and I have been working on with the bill sponsors. This would make the limited teaching license renewable. So this was actually a program that we were able to implement with Representative McInnes. So this would actually take the limited license that's in place right now, allow it to be renewable, but also add instructional support personnel and principals to the retired educator program for high need schools. And so this was actually another program that Katherine and I worked on previously, where you could have teachers come back and teach in the classroom in these high need schools where our school districts are having such a big issue retaining and recruiting teachers, you could actually bring in retired educators without having to wait that 6-month period. So this bill would actually expand that provision, extend that program, which I believe is currently set to expire this summer. It would expand that through 2024 and add instructional support personnel, so like our school psychologists and school counselors, where we are seeing such a high need for those, especially right now in COVID. So moving on to House Bill 545. This is another big win for our teachers. Mandatory training contributing to your CEUs. So again, Representative Elmore, current art school teacher, introduced this bill, and it would allow licensed staff to obtain CEUs from completing mandatory trainings. So things, like infectious disease training, school safety training, all of these like little meetings that our schools are continuing to have to keep our staff informed. This is just really to help the teachers and allow them to get the credit for attending those trainings that right now they're not getting any credit for, but it's still very helpful. Lastly, Senate Bill 582, high school adjunct instructors, community college prep. So this again is trying to get at the teacher shortage that a lot of our districts are experiencing by allowing community college instructors and those with at least one semester of teacher prep at a community college to actually serve as adjunct instructors. So that would be a big help, especially in these areas where, like I said, we are having a teacher shortage, and you already have community college instructors, a lot of times, with master's degrees that have been teaching for a while, but can't actually go back into the classroom without having meeting the teacher licensure requirements. So this would just expand, create some new pathways for our schools to get some pretty high quality teachers. I did just want to mention the agency bills. So you can see here that any of the bills that we mentioned that have AB afterwards, that stands for agency bills. So all of these are actually retirement bills that were proposed by the Treasurer's Office. And I am the first to admit that I am not a retirement expert. I went to law school, so I wouldn't have to do math. And I can admit that, but I really just wanted to put these on your radar, especially if you're a personnel administrator or a finance officer and you are dealing with, retirement changes. Definitely make sure that you're keeping an eye on these bills. We do track them. We do take note when they are amended, but a lot of these bills, guys, are like 30 pages long. It's like reading a phone book, and it's definitely very, very technical. So you guys are the experts, and if you see some issues with these that we may have overlooked, please let us know, and we can definitely advocate on your behalf. So moving on to some more fun retirement issues. This long, intimidating looking summary is for an pension spiking bill and a litigation moratorium. That always sounds excuse me this morning, y'all. So this bill would amend the teachers and state employees retirement system to add another payment option for some contribution-based benefit cap liability. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you are not alone. It is a very technical issue, but basically pension spiking, as it's coined by the state treasurer, is just when an employee's salary is increased pretty dramatically in the last few years of their employment. And that results in an increase in their retirement benefit that they might not have been fully covered by their previous contributions to the state plan. So you have issues, especially with our school administrators, when you basically dedicate your lives as a teacher and you're teaching for all of these years, and then say you want to move up to an administrative position in perhaps your last few years. Basically, the state is saying you didn't pay enough into the system as the teacher. And now there is kind of a discrepancy in our plan because you're getting a higher retirement when you retire. So basically, we see these bills every year. They haven't really made a lot of progress. I believe this bill was actually introduced last session and it didn't pass. But this is just making a few changes to that system, making some clarification as to when the employer is liable. It would actually pause litigation. So this is where you see the litigation moratorium. And this would pause litigation for this issue to establish a work group to report on the anti-pension spiking contribution-based benefit cap. So that's what that little CBBC stands for, to the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on General Government. So this obviously is going to be an issue for a lot of our school administrators. We are keeping an eye on this bill. Anytime you guys want to share or email us and let us know how this would affect you personally in your district, that is always so great for us to be able to share with legislators. Katherine and I can talk to them until we're blue in the face, and a lot of times we do, but it always makes such a big difference when they can actually hear from their constituents about how a bill is personally going to affect them. So moving on to House Bill 392, retirement service purchase. That's just going to allow for an additional purchase of creditable service in the state retirement plan for prior service when it was assumed to be part-time, but it was actually full-time service. And then lastly, House Bill 763. We are excited about this one because it would create an automatic cost of living increase within teasers. And again, this one is by Representative Elmore, who is a current teacher. So you're seeing a lot of really great legislation proposed by the people that, you know, it's actually going to affect, which is awesome. I did note that this bill did not cross over, but it still remains eligible. As Katherine mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of exceptions to crossover, and bills that dealing with appropriations and state pension and retirement, those are exempt. And a lot of times we do see some of these proposals being put into the final state budget package as well, which should be coming out hopefully within the next 2 weeks. Is what we're hearing, is we may have some initial action on the state budget, but we will definitely keep you guys informed. Just a few other Treasury Department agency bills. So this is actually regarding the state health plan, not retirement. Again, you guys are the experts on these, and these are pretty lengthy, very technical bills. Again, we've got a state health plan data transparency. So we're always a little, put on alert whenever we see a transparency bill. Another bill would enhance state health plan debt collection abilities. And then lastly, you've got one that just says state health plan administrative changes. So again, that's going to be a very technical administrative bill. And if you are the person that is in charge with administering or setting up, working with the state health plan, then definitely keep an eye on these bills and let us know if you see any issues that's just really not going to make your job very easy or even harder. Lastly, some other state health plan bills that are not agency bills. So you've got House Bill 178, some access to prescription drug cost administration. I think this sounds like a great idea. It would require insurers to make prescription drug cost information available at the point of prescribing. And then when appropriate, it would require prescribers to make the cost information available to patients at the point of prescribing. And that sounds very helpful. Of course, there's always, the other side of the argument, but we did just want to put that one on your radar. And it does seem like that is a bipartisan bill. A lot of these bills are going to be Republican sponsored. A lot of the bills that are gaining action, actually. Just because they are the party that is in charge of the legislature at the moment. And, that's not unusual, but it is really nice when we see some bipartisan bills and having buy-in from both parties. Another bill would be Senate Bill 159, and you can see I've put that there is a companion House Bill 177. And again, this is another bill with state health plan administrative changes, but this is not an agency bill. They've definitely, I would say, worked with the Treasurer's Office on this bill, but it isn't an agency bill. This would require the State Health Plan Board of Trustees to approve all contracts with a value of greater than $3 million. Right now, they have to approve contracts that are over $500,000. So that's actually a really big increase on what the Board of Trustees is approving and whatnot. It would just raise that. It would eliminate the prohibition on dependent children being able for the state health plan coverage if they are on or actually if they're eligible for another employee's health insurance. So if you've got two parents and one child would be, the dependent child would be eligible to stay on the state health plan, even if they're eligible, say, on the other parent's plan. So continuing coverage for a disabled dependent child past their 26th birthday. So that would be a really great provision that would just allow disabled dependents to stay on that plan. And finally, it would give the executive, I want you guys to note this little provision here. It would give the executive administrator of the state health plan the sole authority, so that's always kind of a red flag there, to determine whether internal appeals are subject to external review. So if this is part of your job is to keep track of state health plan changes, please look at this bill and let us know if you have any comments that you'd like us to share with legislators. Okay, so this is actually the bill that I was thinking of earlier when I was looking at the whistleblower bill, you guys. So please forgive me for kind of having a little brain going up. See, I'm doing it now. Anyways, Senate Bill 542, the state health plan, combat fraud and abuse incentives. So this would allow the state health plan to adopt a program encouraging plan members to report fraud, waste, and abuse by a healthcare provider. And so this is what I was thinking of earlier. It actually provides an incentives to members of up to 2% of any net recovery. So that would be a pretty good incentive for members to report that. There has been a little bit of controversy with this bill, but just wanted to put it on y'all's radar. So moving on, briefly, I did just want to mention some personnel bills that are not crossing over. And remember, just because they didn't meet the crossover deadline doesn't mean they are just totally dead, that we'll never see any of these ideas for the rest of the legislative session. But I did just want to point out, you'll see that a lot of these are proposed by Democrats. And like I said earlier, that's because the Republicans are in charge of the legislature right now. And so that's not unusual. Just some bills relating to non-wage benefits. So we've got some about unemployment insurance reform, restoring educator longevity payments and salaries, restoring benefits to educators and state employees, providing paid parental leave for state employees, and expanding that. So we've got some others on the state health plan and retirement. So we've got equal tax treatment of government retirees. And you can see some are very similar. So like House Bill 75, government retirees tax deduction, that's kind of the same issue. House Bill 71, the Living Donor Protection Act, that would actually give some more time off if you were, donating an organ and needed some time off. That would actually put that in statute. And then we've got, restoring state employee and teacher retiree medical benefits, which is actually, one of our legislative priorities that we're going to keep working on to get through in other ways. And amending the Health Information Exchange Network participation. So just again, I'm not going to get too much into the details of each of these bills because they did not cross over or they are supported by Democrats, and just the data shows that they're not usually going to get much traction unless they have some sort of bipartisan weigh-in with their Republican counterparts. Maybe they've gotten a friend to sign on with them onto a bill. But I did just want to take a minute to point out, all of these wonderful proposals that, have kind of fallen to the wayside just a little bit as we're getting further along in the session. And that's enough talking from me. Hopefully, Katherine won't get quite as tongue twisted as I've been this morning. I'm going to take a sip of water and then hopefully be back and ready to go. But I'm going to let Katherine talk about some testing and accountability bills.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that deep dive into personnel issues. And we're going to jump right into testing and accountability. So moving on to the slide. So as she mentioned, Representative Elmore, who is a teacher, has been very instrumental in introducing a lot of legislation this session. And he also has worked in the testing and accountability area with some of his legislation. The first couple of bills there are from Representative Elmore as the lead sponsor. He has proposed House Bill 486, which would replace our current EOC requirements and our ACT work keys requirement. And the latter, that would be replaced with career readiness, a specific career readiness indicator. Both of those, he pushed the date out of when the change would happen, and that would happen in 2023-24 school year. Part of the reason he did that, we at NCASA asked that either the bill be pulled back or that the timeline for it be extended because of House Bill 677, which is somewhat of a companion bill that he also signed on to with Representative Clemens of Guilford County, who is that lead sponsor. And her recommendation is that there be a work group created under a joint select committee of House and Senate members that will work to develop a new graduate profile for the state of North Carolina. We know that many of you have these in your districts, but this would be a state level graduate profile. And along with that, a whole reform effort for our state accountability system so that it would have multiple indicators rather than the main focus on testing, which is what we have in our current accountability system at this point. So with that effort ongoing, and that is something that our state superintendent of public instruction, Katherine Pruitt, has championed, is this whole process to reform accountability and develop a graduate profile. We were hoping that House Bill 486 would not be put in place before we can determine what are the indicators that are needed to really drive that new graduate profile. So we see that as the first piece needed, and then changing the testing and accountability system along with it could come later. But both of these bills are now in the Senate, of course, and so it will be up to the Senate on which ones they actually move forward this year. Another one from Representative Elmore, House Bill 621, would increase the dropout age. That would happen incrementally between now and 2025-26 and raise the current dropout age of 16 all the way up to 18. Along with that, Representative Elmore rolled into this a piece that we at NCASA and our School Superintendents Association, which is our core affiliate, that we work to recommend to him, and that is giving credit for graduates who actually earn their high school equivalency diploma over at a community college campus. So if they drop out of school right now, we're not getting credit for those individuals if they ultimately get that equivalency diploma. And so what this would do, it reforms the school performance grading score and would add in a percentage. It would add 0.5 point for each % of students who either graduate, earn a regular high school diploma, or get that equivalency diploma. So a helpful change within the indicators of our school performance scoring system. So on the Senate side, there also were some accountability measures that were very important and that we at NCASA requested be provided as waivers for the current school year based on the impact of COVID-19. And these were rolled into an omnibus package entitled K-12 COVID-19 Provisions. and that's contained in Senate Bill 654, which came from the Senate Education Chair Team of Senators Ballard and Lee, and is bipartisan, with Senator Don Davis of Greene County joining that sponsorship team. And the provisions related to accountability in that measure include a whole slate of accountability waivers for the current school year, including waiving the requirement to issue school performance grades, the annual report cards for each school, and adding to low performing school and low performing district designations coming out of this current school year. Along with that, the CPR graduation requirement would be waived for this school year if the graduate meets all other requirements and is in line to graduate. This came to us from our personnel administrators, who asked that we be able to extend the expiration of teaching licenses that are now set to expire on June 30th. So this legislation would extend those by an additional 3 months, allowing additional get credits for renewal. And also clarifying what has to be reported to teachers related to their EVOS data and their effectiveness rating measures. So just indicating that some of the information from this school year, some of that is not relevant because of some of the impacts of COVID-19. So just indicating if that is reported that it came from this year when COVID-19 was an impact. And then last but not least, in this legislation, there's a piece that indicates and clarifies how some of our single track year-round schools can operate with a multi-track system. So there seemed to be a glitch in that definition that was catching some of our districts, and that would fix a glitch for them and allow them to continue on their current calendar. There was one testing and accountability bill that we saw introduced this session that did not cross over, and that is House Bill 152, which would take our current school performance grade and split that into 2 separate grades, with one for growth and one for performance. And so that has fallen by the wayside, we think possibly because, again, of House Bill 677, which is a broader effort to look at a comprehensive school accountability reform effort and not pursue one specific change at this point. But of course, that could be considered as part of the recommendations coming out for how to reform our current accountability system as that work group continues and the Joint Select Committee gets up and running if House Bill 677 does indeed become law. So that's it in the area of testing and accountability. We're going to move now directly into curriculum and instruction, and moving on to the slides there, the first bills under curriculum and instruction. So you see several changes here related to curriculum. And the first one, House Bill 69, would require education on the Holocaust and genocide, again, from Representative Elmore. You see he's a very popular bill sponsor. This legislation has an appropriation with it of $250,000 per year to allow the state to purchase content for delivering the new education focus on Holocaust and the genocide, as well as the cost for providing teachers and others with professional development on how to teach that new piece of the curriculum. So that would be implemented into our standard course of study in the 2023-24 school year, if ultimately signed into law, or added into our state budget and finalized in the state budget package. This bill has not crossed over, but it has been sent to our House Appropriations Committee. So it appears it is on track to be considered as part of the House budget that they will be putting together in the coming weeks. Other bills that have crossed over, we have House Bill 78, which does require a report annually on K-12 computer science data. That would be requiring the state board to submit that report by November 15th. And some of the information to be included would focus on the number of teachers, the courses and students, the numbers of those in computer science and computational thinking. And so LEAs would have a reporting requirement along with the state board, and the LEA deadline would be September 15th of each year. So again, just trying to see how many students and courses are out there in this fast growing field that is we know is becoming more and more of the common landscape for students and how they work in today's society. House Bill 760 is from our education co-chairs, Representatives Blackwell and Torbett. It is bipartisan with Representative Ottman of Guilford County joining, along with Representative Elmore. And this is something they've attempted previously, but it's not gotten through the Senate. So they have revamped this legislation under House Bill 760, and they are calling for creating a panel to look at examining all of the gaps that exist between many constituencies, including gaps among races of students, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, various genders, English language proficiency students, as well as gaps between the different geographic locations of the state where our students are learning. This report would be due by December 1 of 2022. And again, this one has crossed over to the Senate and remains eligible for action. We've seen several pieces of legislation pertaining to the driver education curriculum. So we just briefly listed those here for you without going into depth on all pieces of the bill, because there are some things that do not pertain to driver ed within some of these pieces of legislation. But you have House Bill 285 that would require training on using emergency notification system at railway crossings. You have House Bill 359 that would temporarily waive the driving eligibility certificate requirements and restoring learner's permits and provisional licenses that were revoked during the period of COVID, when some of the driving eligibility certificates were not really readily available for anyone to receive. And then lastly there, House Bill 740 would require training on merging where two lanes converge, and that's called the zipper merge. So just making sure that students in driver education know how to make those merges in places like the Raleigh Beltline, which is always a fun place to drive. And certainly we want to make sure students know how to navigate that safely. So additional curriculum information, moving to the next slide. We've had a lot of discussion in our General Assembly session this year about indoctrination of students in classrooms across North Carolina. And many of you know that our new Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, has launched a commission to look at these kinds of situations where parents have a place they can complain if they think inappropriate content is being taught in classrooms. That's sort of the focus of that. But we're seeing some legislation that seems to be in that same vein. And these are a couple of those bills that we've seen emerge from the State House this session. The first one was one that really popped up right before the crossover deadline. It was brought forward by Representative Torbett of Gaston County, who is one of our education K-12 committee co-chairs. And the title is focusing on ensuring dignity and non-discrimination in schools. And that is under House Bill 324. And the focus of the bill on the surface sounds really like something everyone would all be in favor of, designating the General Assembly's intent that all students, teachers, administrators, and other school employees recognize the equality and rights of all persons. But the nitty-gritty of the bill and what it actually focuses on, it's really prohibiting public schools from promoting certain concepts, mainly those that are tied to a new train of thought that has emerged in recent years, that is considered critical race theory. And the concepts tied to critical race theory would include teaching history in a vein that indicates that the history of the United States is that we are a racist country, or that we are a sexist country, or that our country has taken measures to oppress certain individuals. So it would really impact how our schools could teach history and other subjects, social studies, and ultimately possibly leading to more litigation from parents and others who feel that there are violations in classrooms of content that's being taught. So if this is one that those of you who are heavily focused in curriculum and instruction, if you see concerns with this, this is something you want to weigh in on as this now sits in the Senate to see if they take it up before this session ends later this summer. So something definitely to keep an eye on and weigh in if there are concerns within your district. A similar bill and somewhat related is from the other education co-chair, Representative Blackwell, is the lead sponsor in the House, and that is House Bill 755 on academic transparency. This legislation, as originally filed, would have required every school to post every lesson plan and all content that is provided in any lesson throughout the school the previous year. And we raised concerns about the massive impact of this and how it would cost each district to have to purchase additional servers for each school to just be able to host this content, the timing that it would take for teachers and others who would actually be involved in posting all this information. And so the bill sponsor heard a bit of that in our concerns from many of you and from this organization, and he revised the legislation instead to require a listing and brief description of all the instructional materials and lesson plans for the prior school year. That still is going to require teachers to have to keep really somewhat of a log of each of their lesson plans each day. And if there are any, for instance, guest speakers who come and provide instruction through an assembly or guest speakers in a specific classroom, then that information has to be included in as well. So basically a log of what happens in the classroom every day. And then at the end of the year, that has to be posted on the school's website by June 30th. And if this actually passes, it would take effect for the coming school year. So this is something that would hit us very quickly and have to be dealt with as far as getting everyone ramped up and in the process of recording all this information and posting it for parents and others to see thereafter. One other amendment that we were able to get in the bill was asking that the bill require DPI to create some kind of template for LEAs to use in this reporting process if it does become law, because we felt there would be a need for some sort of guideline on what needed to be reported and how to be in compliance. This is one we continue to have concerns with. We definitely conveyed that to the bill sponsor. He asked us what it would take for us to like this bill, and we told him we would never love this bill, and we appreciated any changes he could make in it. But this is one that we saw as burdensome and really overly intrusive to the instructional process for schools. If you share that concern, then you definitely need to weigh in with the Senate Education Committee and make sure that this one is not taken up and moves forward this session, because we do think it is problematic for many of you. So moving on. We also this session have seen several measures related to the education of our exceptional children. And the first one there, Senate Bill 103, we think the governor is actually in line to sign this one into law today. And what this one would do would be to create a new licensure process for behavior analysts who now have to operate under the auspices of a licensed psychologist. But this would be a new licensed person who could specifically focus on children with autism, and opens really another pool of employees who might be helpful to you in working with children with autism in our public schools. So this is a positive one that's likely to become law even later today. The next one, Senate Bill 593, is one that we've worked on with members of our board of directors who are involved with the North Carolina Administrators of Special Education, NCASA. And they have some concerns about this legislation because it would eliminate one of the components of the current due process hearings, the steps in those hearings, by taking out the requirement that if an administrative law judge issues a decision, that the case has to go next to the State Board of Education on appeal. And so with that appeal coming out, then that would allow families to go directly to state or federal court as their next course of action. And ultimately, we know that our special education administrators are concerned that ultimately this could mean even further delays in how these cases are handled, because the State Board of Education has certainly a focus on education. And if these go directly into courts and just sit there and spin their wheels, then when will the cases be resolved, and when will our special education students get the actual support that they need? And so a concern there about this timeline. We know ultimately it's meant to be parent and family focused, but again, could this have some unintended negative consequences for some of our children with some of the most the most specific needs within our school systems across the state? Another one here is a good one that we know is supported widely throughout our membership, both in the finance office and with our special education directors. Again, from our Representative Elmore, House Bill 249, which would change our children with disabilities funding formula. This one has been referred to the Appropriations Committee in the House, which again means it's likely that this one's going to be rolled into the House budget. At least we hope to see it there. And what this would do would be direct the Department of Public Instruction to develop a new children with disabilities funding model that would be based on severity of disability. It also would raise the funding cap from the current 12.75%, which we know many of our districts are operating above already and having to put in funding separate and apart from the state funding cap, funding that is capped at 12.75%. This would raise it to 13% effective July 1. Again, if it is signed into law, either as a standalone measure or if it's rolled into our state budget. So hoping to see more on that one in the coming weeks. House Bill 222 would designate a week in November as the Sudden Unexpected Death and Epilepsy Awareness Week, SUDEP. It also would ask that our school boards across the state ensure training for all staff who are responsible for students with epilepsy or who are known to have seizure disorders. And so just to focus, making sure those students get the support they need whenever they have those medical emergencies. There also is legislation from a House team, House Bill 756, which would indicate they would like to see the state of North Carolina become a model employer for individuals with disabilities. And so this would direct our Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of State Human Resources to develop that program and really launch the state into becoming that model employer for these specific individuals. And then lastly there, from Representative Blackwell, this would focus on changing the administration of the schools for the deaf across the state. There are two of those, one in Burke County and one in the eastern part of the state. And that would actually create a separate board for each of those residential school campuses. Whereas now there's just the auspices of the residential schools that is a part of DPI and the arm of those specific schools. And so this will create more local control of those campuses. Right, moving on to the next slide. We're going to move quickly into the segment on virtual learning and a focus on some remote instruction legislation we've seen from both the House and Senate, somewhat related, but taking a different approach. And so a measure from Representative Elmore, House Bill 644, focused on basically formalizing the process that many of our districts have been using for years in the absence of specific legislative approval to launch and operate virtual or remote academies. And under his legislative proposal, the State Board of Education would be authorized to continue allowing LEAs to operate remote academies, and they could set those up for 5-year terms that could be renewable. But the legislation would put some limits in on the numbers of remote academies and the numbers of students who could be served by them. And the limit would be each LEA would be capped at 10% of the district's total enrollment. And then depending on the size of the LEA, you would have limits on how many specific schools you could operate. So only one if you have fewer than 15,000 students, all the way up to you could have 5 if you have 100,000 students or more. So specific limits and a whole new process put in place for approval. When the legislation was first filed, we were hearing concerns about many school districts already have a remote academy with a school code, and would they have to go through the process for approval? And so Representative Elmore amended this legislation to indicate that any virtual academy that had a school code by May 1st would be allowed to operate in 2021-22 and would not have to go through this new approval process. But he does designate that the state board would need to adopt some emergency rules by November and then report annually by that same date on the effectiveness of any remote academies that are out there operating across the state so that they can be monitored and ensure that we have a good rigorous process in place for ensuring that these are good for students. In the Senate, we mentioned earlier that there's an omnibus bill related to COVID-19 provisions from Senators Ballard, Davis, and Lee, Senate Bill 654. It also has some pieces related to remote instruction. So a few of the things that it does with that regard, the legislation would allow most LEAs across the state to use up to 5 remote instruction days or 30 hours of instruction during the school year. And this would start next school year and be effective only for next school year. And if you choose to use those remote instruction days, the LEA would need to submit a remote instruction plan to the state board by July 1 of this year and indicate that you're going to use those days in lieu of inclement weather closures that you might encounter during the school year. So you're building them into the calendar as replacement for closing due to weather emergencies or other state emergencies you might encounter. And a caveat that the Senate put in this legislation before it crossed over would be trying to help districts that have lots of severe weather each year, mainly in our mountain counties in particular, that have a lot of snow and ice. Those that qualify for what's called the good cause waiver under the school calendar law would have up to 15 days or 90 hours that you could use in remote instruction in lieu of these weather or emergency closures. So a twist there in how you might operate your inclement weather days. This is very different than the current school year where you to provide 5 remote instruction days. Now this is saying you may in lieu of these kinds of specific emergency measures. The bill also would allow other remote instruction days to be utilized to address any COVID concerns that might linger into the next school year. And if those kinds of switch to remote instruction needs to happen within your district, that would be subject to parental consent for moving those students into remote instruction for any COVID-related concerns. And then allowing all virtual learning options that are currently being utilized by our districts, having those to continue into the next school year. As this legislation moved along, we had been concerned that it was going to basically prohibit the virtual school within a school model that we know many of our districts have utilized. And because it initially had put in a date of May 1st by which every school that wanted to operate as a virtual school had to have a code. That was taken out of the legislation mainly in response to concerns from NCASA and many of you in our membership weighing in and talking about how problematic that would be for you. So that was amended out. And instead, all of our current virtual learning options, including blended learning, schools within a school, all of that can continue next year with parental consent if you submit a remote instruction plan to DPI by June 1st. And that is for those kinds of things to continue. And sort of following up on all of this, DPI, which already has established a work group on this, will put together recommendations, and they must submit it to the legislature by January 1st on what are the recommended parameters for how virtual learning and virtual academies will operate after the school year that we're going into later this summer. So a couple of different options there on remote instruction with different House and Senate versions that have crossed over. And we will be seeing which one of those appears to have the most legs and moves forward for final action as we go into sort of the second half of this session of the General Assembly. And I believe, yes, so we've got one more thing to touch on here. We know many of you, especially in this time of remote instruction and school closures that you've navigated over the last 2 years, the whole issue of technology and broadband has been very significant for you, and the kind of connectivity that you have in your district really can impact the way you are serving students in your district. So there's a big focus in our General Assembly about continuing to expand broadband across the state and ensuring that students have the access that they need no matter where they are learning. So some of the measures related to that we've placed on this slide for you. House Bill 79, coming from Representative Blackwell as the lead sponsor, would ask that the State Board of Education create and maintain a digital learning dashboard that's updated annually with information from all public school units. And it would include information on student access to various digital devices, both in and out of school, as well as student access to internet connectivity outside the school setting. Another part of that is that DPI would work with the Department of Information Technology to conduct a statewide assessment of digital device and connectivity. And that would be backdated to when COVID first hit back in the 2019-20 year and what happened in the current year, so that we can kind of see where things were as additional support for broadband and devices all continues to be expanded. Under House Bill 289 would require that the Department of Information Technology become the sole provider for statewide broadband mapping for state agencies. And this would have an appropriation of just over $1 million to cover the cost of that process. So this one is possibly going to be rolled into the state budget as it's sponsored by Representative Arp, who's one of our lead sponsors. It's one of our lead chairs of the House Appropriations Committee. House Bill 813 would prohibit state agencies, and although not in the title, would also prohibit school districts from paying ransomware for any kind of breach that might happen within your own school technology system. House Bill 947 is basically placeholder legislation, but it is indicated to be a major expansion of the GREAT grant process that we have, which is growing rural economies and technology. And that one, there's some placeholder funding listed there, and this has been sent to House Appropriations. So another thing that we could see in our state budget, but it would appropriate $400 million to expanding broadband in areas that don't have it, $12 million for grants for fixed wireless and satellite broadband, and then another $340 million for additional broadband infrastructure grants. So a major boost in the arm for expanding broadband across the state could happen with this legislation. And then similarly, Senate Bill 517 in the Senate would also be placeholder legislation for looking at ways to expand the GRADE program and those grants, and specific funding amounts to be determined. So more to come on that as we get into the budget in the coming weeks. And I believe for now that takes us through the pieces I needed to cover for this segment. We're going to move back to Elizabeth to hear a bit about some legislation related to financial operations.
Thanks, Katherine. So I'm going to move right on into some financial operations bills. Oop. There we go. So starting off with House Bill 18, local school administrative unit cash management. This would it is actually a positive bill that would authorize public school units to hold state funds in local bank accounts for up to 3 days after the date of drawing on state funds before making a final disbursement to the ultimate payee. And so that was actually, this is actually a bill requested by some of our local school financial officers. And they said it would just really streamline this process for having to pay checks and disperse funds without having to send those funds back to the treasurer and then back to them to, to make the final disbursements. So that one did make crossover. Moving on to House Bill 335, timely local payments to charter schools. So this is a bill that we've been having ongoing negotiations with a lot of the charter school advocates about. The first version of this bill it was very problematic for LEAs. So we did sit down with the charter school lobbyists and just kind of fine tune some of the aspects of the bill, such as the information that charter schools would have to provide LEAs in order for LEAs to feel comfortable paying those invoices from the charter schools, for their student enrollment. So this bill would require LEAs to provide specific student enrollment information, which is, a positive for the LEA, but it would also require the LEAs to pay penalties if they don't transfer the per pupil share of the local expense fund to the charters within the statutory time frame, which I believe is within 30 days of the receipt of the funds or the verification of the enrollment, but don't hold me to that. It's been a while since I looked at that specific provision, so I'm going to go back and look at that. But just to put this bill on y'all's radar, it would also direct the state superintendent of public instruction to create a standardized procedure for the requests and the transfers of these funds. So right now there is no standardized process. But this, we think, would really benefit both sides, especially if it's a collaborative effort between the LEAs and the charters as to how this process should go in the future. Moving on to House Bill 508, education funding transparency. This is another bill that we had some issues with. You can see that it did not cross over. But it actually required a detailed LEA budget down to program and object codes. And also it would essentially give county commissioners more authority over the funds that they were providing to the LEAs. And so we were actually really glad that we had some input from our financial officers on this bill, and we were actually able to sit down with bill sponsors and make some pretty good changes. Overall, we still were not big fans of the bill, never we're gonna be, but thankfully the bill did not move over based on objections from us and several other groups. So this one for right now doesn't seem like something that we have to worry too much about. But moving on to House Bill 778, this one we were a little disappointed about. This was actually Representative Bradford was a big help with this bill for us. It would essentially increase the LEA's flexibility to transfer funds between allotments within specified limits. So, it wasn't just giving the LEAs total control over what they do with their funds. It was definitely within specific limits, and it would allow them to retain certain funds at the end of this fiscal year rather than having those funds to revert to the state. So essentially, we heard from a lot of districts that there is a lot of money, especially federal relief money, being floated around, but with all the different restrictions and administrative hurdles to jump through, a lot of districts were concerned about not being able to use that money as best as they see fit, or even not being able to use the money at all, and it actually reverts to the state. So this bill would have been really helpful. Unfortunately, a lot of, some of the members did not agree with that. So this bill, unfortunately, did not cross over, but we are going to continue to advocate on trying to have this flexibility so that our LEAs can use the funds in areas that our students most need it. So moving on to some school facility bills, House Bill 70, the Historic School Preservation Act. I feel like we see a lot of these historic schools acts every year. I didn't even know we had that many, but apparently we do, and this would actually increase the historical rehab tax credit if you use a certified historic structure for an educational purpose. And so that bonus amount would be equal to 5% of the expenses of the rehabilitation of the property at a cap of $1 million. Another bill, House Bill 704, local option sales tax flexibility. This has actually been introduced the past couple of sessions, I believe. And so far it hasn't been passed, but Representative Howard is always on the ball trying to get this moving forward, and it did cross over. So this is one that we're definitely going to keep an eye on. It just modifies existing local option sales tax rates. It provides the counties with the option of specifying on the ballot what the proceeds of the tax will be used for. So, a lot of voters, especially conservative voters, are concerned about, increasing sales tax, and this would just, I guess, create a little bit more of a peace of mind as to, okay, this money will be going towards education, and it's just giving a little bit more peace of mind there. It does make a few other changes to local sales and tax rates. And so definitely check that out if you are working with county commissioners a lot, or if you're really on top of the sales tax issues in your local districts. Moving on to House Bill 794 by Representative Art. This would allow schools to be designated as a permitted use in all zoning districts, and prevent or prohibit development regulations from limiting schools to locations contiguous to state maintained roads. So that's definitely going to be one to keep an eye on if you are if your job is really relating to school facilities and building permits and that sort of thing. Takes me back a little to my law school days when I was studying land use regulation. So definitely we will be keeping an eye on that bill. Moving on to some school choice bills. These are always pretty controversial, so we really try to follow these very closely and work with bill sponsors and other groups to amend these bills, which we see these bills pretty much every session. So starting off with Senate Bill 87. This isn't specifically, I guess, about school choice, but more about, charter schools and the benefits for those employees. So this bill would just deem charter schools as local government entities so that they can receive federal Medicaid reimbursement. And so that would be a similar manner as to what our other LEAs are already have access to. Another bill, House 616, this is one you definitely need to keep an eye on. This is called the Charter Replication Act. So right now we do have a process at the state board for basically fast tracking charters. This would create a new process for charters that are basically replicating, as in the name of the bill title. So this would create a fast track for those replication charters. And in order to be eligible for that fast track, the applicant would have to show that that their board of directors has been able to maintain positive student outcomes for the past 3 years. So either equal to or better than what the LEA, their student outcomes are, and also 3 years of financially sound audits. Alternatively, you can also have an agreement with a board of directors to actually contract with an education management or a charter organization, and they would also have to show positive academic outcomes and financially sound audits from the past 3 years from the majority of schools that organization manages. So that's not, all the schools, but just a majority of the schools that they manage. Another bill, House Bill 729. This is the Charter School Omnibus. This one is also one we definitely need to pay attention to. It would authorize our charter schools to provide remote instruction, which was interesting because, as Katherine has just mentioned, there is a lot of bills that were attempting to regulate or restrict LEA's ability to offer remote instruction, but this would just say charter schools can use remote instruction to satisfy their instructional time requirements, like no further restrictions or anything. The second part might be even a little bit more concerning in that it would authorize counties to provide capital funds to charter schools. So right now, there is no provision for them to provide this capital funds, but it's also important to note that this makes it optional. It does not require counties to provide funds, but it's saying that they can if they would like to. Another concerning provision, part of this bill would clarify the NCGA's intent to ensure parity for state funds for charter schools. So making sure that charter schools essentially receive parity in funds as our other LEAs. So that's definitely a provision that we want to keep an eye on. And lastly, it would just allow charters to also request residency licenses for their teachers, similar to LEAs. So another bill regarding charter schools I wanted to mention would be House Bill 825. And this is just making some changes to the Charter School Advisory Board, or CSAB. If you are listening to our State Board of Education meetings. So as the bill notes, it's making changes to this board in order to allow the state superintendent or her designee to be a voting member of the board. Currently, the state superintendent can have someone on the board, but they're not a voting member. So there's kind of a little bit of issue trying to get people to fill essentially like a symbolic position. And it would also eliminate one of the State Board of Education's appointees to the board, and also stagger the terms of office for members appointed by the General Assembly. So all of these bills, obviously, we are paying pretty close attention to. They all made crossover. So I just definitely wanted to put those on y'all's radar. So moving on to private school vouchers, or what we tend to think about more when we're thinking about school choice issues. Like I said, there's always some bills that have been introduced each session that would make changes to the opportunity scholarship programs. House Bill 32, this would actually expand eligibility for the opportunity scholarship to 4-year-olds who are not currently eligible. It would also increase the scholarship awards from $4,200 per year as a standard to up to 70% of the average state per pupil allocation in the prior fiscal year. And that would actually increase to up to 80% by statute in 2023-24. Lastly, it would also merge what is now called the Personal Education Savings Account and separately the accounts for children with disabilities into one new long program that nobody wants to read, but it's the Personal Education Student Accounts for Children with Disabilities program. So try saying that 5 times fast. And then lastly, Senate Bill 671 has pretty much the same provisions as in House Bill 32. A lot of times with these bills, you will see kind of a companion bill in the opposite chamber, just in case, one chamber's bill passes or, it gets really amended. Just typically there are going to be proposed changes in both the House and the Senate. So I did want to mention some school choice bills not crossing over, but just remember, just because they didn't cross over doesn't mean they're totally dead. That would be Senate Bill 571. So this would codify and expand the renewal school system. Basically, I mean, the title of the bill is what it does. It would codify and expand eligibility for the renewal school system so that more schools can participate. But I did note here that in the bill, it actually appropriates $500,000 for the 21-22 fiscal year and another $500,000 in 22-23. And so because those fees are included in that bill, this bill is actually exempt from crossover. So that's important to note. Another bill, Senate Bill 609, this would be a waiver for the innovative school districts. So another thing that we have had requested. This would waive inclusion of additional schools in the ISD for the 2020 school year, 2021 school year, so this year, but already identified schools based on data from 2018-19 remain on the qualifying list. So this would be a similar waiver as to what we saw last year when our schools were still right in the midst of COVID-19 and responding to that. And it really just wouldn't be fair for schools to be included in the ISD when, a lot of the low performance issues are being caused by all of the COVID craziness. So we're definitely hoping that this bill will end up being in a budget or in some other bill, because we definitely need those waivers again this year. So I'm going to hand it off again to Katherine, who's going to talk about some bills regarding school safety and keeping our students healthy. Katherine.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And because I see that we are short on time, I'm actually going to skip this segment on safe schools and healthy students. As we indicated at the beginning of the webinar, you are going to get these slides, so you have these bill notes. So certainly should have what you need for those. So we're going to roll forward. Keep rolling, Elizabeth. There you go. Skip through these. Skip, skip, skip. And that brings us to a point in our webinar where we're going to hear from our second co-sponsor of the morning. And it is my pleasure at this time to recognize our friends from Edmentum. We have with us Jamie Quinn and Nicole White. And so, folks, thank you for being with us this morning, and we're happy to hear a bit about the services you provide to our school districts. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Katherine and everybody else. And it's great to be here. I saw a lot of familiar names, even had a couple texts while we were here. It's great to see everybody. Really quickly, I want to just say thank you for what you do. And I know that like a lot of the representatives that are seeming to come up with so many bills lately, you guys are extremely busy as well this time of year. So are we. As a matter of fact, Nicole and I have been kind of doing a road show, trying to get in as many districts as we can, really kind of trying to be a catalyst for a collaborative community, just much like we did last year, and trying to pull a lot of our partners together. And you know, I saw you guys talking about the templates and things like that. That's the kind of stuff we do. We try to figure out how we can kind of be a conduit between different school districts and different schools so that we can all kind of share best practices and, you know, and help us all be a little more efficient and effective. So would you mind flipping to that next slide really quickly? It's kind of a busy slide. So what I want to do is kind of pare it down a little bit and do the old shameless plug for what Adminum is. And it's our 60th anniversary this year. And so we're pretty excited. And it's 60 years of putting what we believe to be the best digital content in the hands of educators. And we do it all across the country. As a matter of fact, we're an international company. And not only do we have what we think is the best and most engaging content, we also do personalized learning as well as formative assessment. A lot of districts are very familiar with using Study Island and Exact Path to mitigate some of the losses that you had during this COVID crazy stuff, but also using our formative assessment tools to really move those EOGs and EOCs. Whether you want to use our curriculum with your teachers or our teachers, we can also do that as well. We do mentoring for virtual teachers. We basically do whatever it is that school districts need, and we tailor it around what your students are in need of. But we believe the differentiator is that bottom left corner. We pride ourselves in award-winning customer service year in and year out. White glove service is what we provide, and I honestly believe as a former superintendent and principal and about everything else, from school level to district office level, that is the thing that always made the difference to me. Are they there in the good times? Yep. But are they there in the bad times too? And that's what Adminum commits to do for all of you guys in North Carolina, guys and ladies, excuse me. So please feel free to reach out to us. And if there's anything that we can do to help you or even have a rich conversation about what some of our other partners are doing, we would love to hear from you. Jamie, Quinn, and Nicole White, and Elizabeth and Katherine, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie and Nicole. Okay, so we're in the home stretch. We're going to look at next some of the K-12 education laws that have already been signed and made it all the way through the hoops this year. Rather than covering these for you, I'll tell you what we did here. These are only the ones that pertain mainly to policy. So we've had some others that are dealing with some of the federal relief funding that the state passed through to our school districts and to the Department of Public Instruction. Those are not listed here. But what we did here on this slide, which you will be getting in follow-up, we linked the bill that has become law. So you got the session law link as well as a link to the full summary of each. And all of you have been working with these already. They pertain to the Reopening Our Schools Act, the Summer Learning Program that we know you're in the midst of planning, the Excellent Public Schools Act, which we had a separate webinar on earlier in this series, dealing with the Read to Achieve changes that are set to take place. And then, of course, there's the education changes for military connected students. So we're not going to dig deeply into those this morning, but just wanted to put them on your radar as these are ones that we know have to be implemented. So definitely take a look at those summaries, make Elizabeth and me aware if you have any questions, if we can provide any additional information. And then we'll keep our eye on the rest of the ones that still have a ways to go before they become law and actually hold specific requirements for you. We're going to move into our Q&A segment, and I tried to get through all of the questions that I saw in either the chat or the Q&A, and I think we probably had the most questions on the remote instruction pieces. So those are very confusing. I'll just sum that up by saying, really, the specific requirements of those two different bills, House Bill 644 and Senate Bill 654, no, wait a minute, House Bill 644 and Senate Bill 654. Those two have some differing proposals, and really we can't answer specific questions on exactly what will be required until we see which of those vehicles moves and what content of each holds. We can only kind of cover what each hold right now, but they can be changed and reshaped as they continue to move forward in the other chamber where they've now crossed over to. So we're continuing to keep an eye on those. But basically, it appears there is some discussion about allowing the school within a school model to continue. You may have a specific deadline, which would be determined by final legislation on any plan about remote instruction you might need to submit to the Department of Public Instruction. And we will certainly be asking the department to put together some templates to help you with any kind of planning and plan submission you might need to submit. So I know there's a superintendent's meeting with the Department of Public Instruction tomorrow, and I think that would be a great question for some of our superintendents to bring up in that discussion with them, that you need some templates related to what you're going to need to submit on remote instruction for next school year. So we'll ask that as well. If there are no additional questions at this point, then we're going to continue and wrap up this morning's session. So just want to put on your radar some of the other webinars in this series. We talked a little bit about broadband today, but we're going to do a deeper dive into broadband and what the opportunities might look like for the coming school year. That's going to be in our webinar on June 7th, and we're going to feature on that attendants as well as one of our technology leaders, and then Representative Jason Sain, who is probably the leading of broadband expansion in our General Assembly. He's someone we work with a lot on that, and he's one of our House budget writers, one of the senior co-chairs of House Appropriations. And so he can give us sort of the lay of the land on what we might see coming out of this session of the General Assembly. And then following that one on June 21st, Elizabeth and I will be back with you. And we hope at that point to tell you what's in the state budget proposals from both the House and Senate. We certainly hope to see one, if not both proposals by that point, because they need to be pulling it together to get a new budget in place by July 1, if they're going to meet that deadline. So we're very hopeful by June 21st to have more information to share on what is shaping up to be our new state budget for the coming school year. So definitely plan to join us for those and other parts of this series. And just leaving you with the contact information for our team. Please let us know how we can better support you. We know you all are extremely busy as you are trying to close out the current school year. You're planning for summer school that you have to offer, and you're also trying to get ready for opening a new school year, hopefully without all the constraints of COVID that you all have been heroes and champions in navigating for the last 2 years. Hoping for more normalcy for each and every one of you and your school districts as we get into that new school year that's ahead of us this summer. In the meantime, please let us know how we can help you, what questions you have, and the kinds of information you'd like to see us putting together in these and future events. And know that we are trying to have our first in-person event since COVID hit, and that will be our school law symposium coming up at the end of September. So after you get back into school and start that new school year and get settled, we hope to see many of you in person at that event, September 20th and 21st at the McKimmon Center in Raleigh. And registration for that's going to be opening very soon. So stay well. Best wishes in closing out this school year, and stay in touch. And we hope to see you either on our next webinar or in person again very soon. Thank you again to our partners and sponsors today with Edmentum and Pierce Group. And good luck, and we'll see you again at that next webinar, if not before. So best wishes to you all.
Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a great week. Thank you.